My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Joel Bigman. Joel, you are a doctor of chemistry, you work in engineering, and the reason you're on the podcast today has absolutely nothing to do with that. It's because you're the author of the recently published The Second Journey by Earnshaw Publishing. The Second Journey is a reimagining, it's a continuation novel. Technically, that would be the jargon we use in literature circles, a continuation novel of the Shioji, the Journey to the West. You reimagined the journey in a very Jewish form. And I just want to say thank you for coming on the podcast today.
It's certainly my pleasure.
Mm.
I would say that my being a chemist is not entirely unconnected in the sense that if one asks why somebody like me would get interested in Chinese literature or Chinese culture in general. And I work as a chemist in the semiconductor industry. Have been for the past 20 years. And so I travel to Asia quite a bit. And if you keep your eyes and ears open, you can gradually develop an interest in what's going on, and you see a different culture. And that's so there is a connection. There is not a connection to the alchemy or Taoist concoctions. I stay away from that.
Thank goodness. You started traveling frequently to Asia for business. How did you get interested in one of the most important novels in Chinese literature? It's not something that every business traveler who goes to Asia falls in love with, but you apparently did.
I started thinking from a Jewish viewpoint. One of the similarities between Jewish culture and Chinese culture is the respect for ancient literature. I started wondering if it would be possible to write a book that would combine the two. And I did not know a whole lot about Chinese literature. I visited Taiwan and China and other countries that are connected, like Korea and Japan. And then I said, well, I should read the classic Chinese works. So actually, the idea of writing such a book came before I know what I was going to use as a basis. So I started with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, thinking that I would, well, there's wars and battles and heroes, and I thought that might fit in with some biblical things.
It's not all that different from the early history books in the Bible, right?
But it just didn't click. And then I picked up the Journey to the West, and I started reading the Journey to the West, and somehow that clicked a lot better. I think the characters are a large part of it. It's a fun read. I first I read it. I had read Anthony Siu's translation from the University of Chicago, and he has extensive introduction and footnotes, which I think I read every footnote the first time I read the book, because there's
That's a lot
many,
of
many,
footnotes.
a lot of footnotes. Yeah, I would keep two bookmarks in the book, one where I'm reading and one with the pages of the footnotes. Unfortunately, he's passed away. I would have gone to some effort to thank him because it really was a great help, his work. Most of this was happening during the COVID thing. So I was at home reading Journey to the West, and it was entertaining. And I saw these characters that would later be used. Since then, we're already going through the classics. I read the what's called The Dream of the Red Chamber. I don't know the Chinese name.
Oh, la la.
There you go. And the field of study for that is called redology,
Yeah,
which
Feng
is
Shui.
yeah. And actually, I heard the Water Margin or Outlaws of the Marsh. I heard it as a podcast.
Mm.
And I actually read Jinping Mei, which is an interesting book. And if we have time, we could say a few words about that. I think the books might be underrated or out of the pale for the wrong reasons, actually.
Yeah. I think Jinping Mei has actually been kind of quietly banned in China under Xi Jinping. I've heard that. I don't know if that's really true, but I've heard it's gotten much harder to get your hands on a copy. I guess we should say why. It's a pornographic novel that has some very violent sexual scenes. Like, it would embarrass an HBO executive.
Yes, but it does have a moral thread through it. And I think it's pornographic in another way. People think of pornography as being connected to sex. I think it's pornographic in terms of the entire lifestyle of the upper class. You see
Mm,
the descriptions of the food, the banquets they have, and the contrast between what they're eating and what the servants and slaves are eating.
mm.
And a lot of the book goes around that topic. But I did not write a novel based on that, though since then I've toyed with the idea, but I don't know what my wife would think.
We should make a film.
No, 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 no. There's a limit to what I would go through.
I know some guys in California who could probably help us out. Okay, enough nasty jokes. Let's get back to your book, The Second Journey.
Maybe I'll explain briefly what the concept of the book is. In the original, there's the monk goes with his companions to India to bring back the Buddhist scriptures. It's a true story, actually, an original story. But as we know, the characters that accompany him are not exactly historical. So I got into my mind that, oh, what would happen if he went on a second journey and went a little bit further west to what's today Iran, but Persia, and what was Byzantine or Roman Palestine at the time, what's currently Israel, and met the ancient Jewish sages. This is the basic concept of the book. The motivation for going is that there's a Jewish community in Kaifeng that need a teacher to help them because they've forgotten how to read their ancient scriptures. I will point out right now that I I use a considerable amount of literary freedom. It's a fantasy book, and the chronology is not kosher, shall we say. The historical monk Xuanzang lived about 200 years after most of the rabbis I talk about
Mm.
actually did. But I allowed myself some poetic license because it's a fantasy, and if you've got a monkey king and a pig and various gods and so on, then you can do whatever you want, which I did. So they go on this journey and they run into stories. They basically participate in stories that are in the ancient Jewish writings. I would call them midrash stories, mostly in the Talmud. I don't know if you're familiar with the Talmud. It is a very long, large collection of all kinds of things. It's mostly legal discussions, but interspersed in it are legendary tales about all sorts of things, rainmaking, miracles that happen, very pious people, and an apostate rabbi who I actually becomes an important character in my book. So I have Xuanzang come with Sun Wukong and Tsubaji with the pig and the monkey only, because in the original story, they have also a horse who was a dragon, and there's another Monk, Wing, I don't know
Sandy, yeah. He's kind of a
Sandy.
nothing burger. Even in the original book, he
Right,
doesn't
right.
really do that much. It's mostly
So
Pigsy and Monkey there.
which is why I took them.
Yeah. And you don't so the original novel has Tang Monk, Xuanzang with Monkey and Pigsy going from China to Central Asia, Xinjiang, going all the way down to India, picking up the Holy Scriptures. With your book, it's the monk, Tang Monk. You've got Pigsy, Monkey, and they go west and they keep going west and they pick up another character, a Jewish character who I was going to ask you about. Bear, he's the second Samson. Can you tell me why pick this guy and add him as kind of the instead of having the two nothing burger characters in the original novel, which is Sandy and the horse? Why add this bear?
There's actually two answers to this. One is, first of all, I needed a character who would explain things. We have our two cultures meeting, and I needed somebody who'd be like a go-between who would explain to them, but also potentially to the reader, what is happening. So I needed such a character. And many years ago, we had a distant relative who was called the Second Samson. And that's what gave me the idea. This really happened. He was a Jewish strongman, grew up in Poland, and escaped Europe during the war or before the war, ended up in Chile in South America, and was a strongman in the circus there. And we have a little book from the circus. It says El Segundo Samson, which was a second Samson. He gave me the concept of a second Samson. And his name is actually Bear, first name.
Okay, so that's why you chose to have your character be a bear. I was thinking that there might be something in Jewish mythology with bears that I just wasn't aware of, but no, it's actually entirely personal. That's awesome.
It's a personal thing. Naming people after animals is actually not uncommon in Hebrew. You'll see somebody who has a Jewish person whose name is Wolf. In Hebrew, it's Ze'ev. And in the Bible, actually, there's somebody who's named Donkey, Hamor, the son of Shem. So today we think, who do you call donkey? That's like insulting. But at the time, maybe donkeys were considered very important.
It's in the novel. You also have a donkey who sometimes speaks, but doesn't speak too much. A very quiet, unloquacious donkey. How much of the novel takes place in what's today Israel, and how much of it takes place outside of Israel?
Most of it is actually in Israel, but part is in what's present day Iran, which was Persia at the time.
Hmm.
The Jewish, the period I'm talking about, the Talmudic period, it actually covers a couple hundred years. But the Jewish community was partly in Israel and partly in Persia at the time, in the Sassanian Empire. And there's actually a split between the two communities. If you read the Talmud, you will see that there's people who travel back and forth between them, carrying the learning from one place to another. What's the rule about this? Well, I was back in Israel and I heard that the rulings like this, a lot of oral traditions and so on going on. But I don't actually point out in the novel exactly where you are at any point. And some of it I had in my mind. There's some very specific things that was clear to me where they are, but to the reader, not necessarily.
And
And
it's a
some
historical fantasy, so that's part of the fun. That brings me to another discussion I thought we should have on the podcast. I've talked a little bit about the Jewish population in China. You reference that the book begins in this very Deuteronomic move, if I may say so. I think it's museum workers in Xi'an discover a new book. This is that book that's, Tang Monk made a second journey. And the reason that he's in Chang'an doing his translation work, this is post returning from India with the Tripitaka, the books that make up the sacred scriptures of Buddhism that were brought by Tang Monk to China around 630, 640. That's a historical event. Event's probably not the right word, but there really was a large community of Jews in the city of Kaifeng. We know that there were Jews traveling in Tang, China.
Jewish traders went back and forth. They talk about the Silk Road. If you read the
Mm,
Talmud, you'll see rabbis in like the fourth century who
mm,
are silk traders.
mm,
He was a silk trader.
mm.
But it doesn't
Interesting.
necessarily mean that he himself went all the way to China because the goods traveled. They probably went part way and then continued on. I use them as an excuse, really.
I know that there were Hebrew prayers discovered at Dunhuang in the library cave, and so that's sealed up around 1000 AD. There is some Hebrew graffiti discovered in modern day Pakistan near Gilgit. So going through the Karakoram Pass from Pakistan to China, that road. So there is we don't know that much about the Jewish community at the time, but we do know that it's there. Matty O'Ricky, the Jesuit priest who's the most famous founding sinology, the most famous Matty O'Ricky, he hears about these people who aren't Muslims but kind of like Muslims. And as he's talking about his God and all of these stories and Moses, for someone they're like, oh, that rings a bell. You should go see these guys in Kaifeng who they have a similar kind of thing. And he gets down there and they're the Jews there in Kaifeng are struggling to survive as Jews. In fact, they won't really survive as Jews for much longer. He gets down there in the late Ming, and they still have a synagogue and they still practice a lot of parts of what you would expect as Judaism, but they're very much cut off from the wider community for several centuries by this point. And then when the Ming dynasty falls in 1644, some floods destroy Kaifeng. And we actually think we have the Torahs from those floods because we have water damaged Torahs that are actually in Ohio. They're at a
Ohio?
Ohio, yeah. They were actually rescued from China, I think, early in the 20th century, and taken to there's a very famous Jewish seminary.
The Hebrew Union College, I
Yeah,
think,
that's
is
is it
there.
the one in Cincinnati, right?
Cincinnati, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So I think they're actually at the Hebrew Union College.
college.
Yeah, it's a insanely globalized journey. So we do know that they did exist. And a lot of those Jews actually, once the community was kind of pretty damaged by the flooding, a lot of them became Muslims, have a lot of the same dietary restrictions. They're monotheistic. They're also a minority there, but they're just a much larger minority. Since the 1980s, some of those people who came from Jewish families, they were able to trace their Jewish heritage through their last name. They have restored some of their Jewish identity. And I think many of them made Aliyah and went to Israel.
I actually have seen religious, like Orthodox Jewish people who look Chinese around here and there, but I don't know if they're from that community or
Hmm.
sometimes people just join up brotheries. So I'm familiar with most of this. I've seen the scrap of I don't know if it's parchment with the Hebrew prayer that was in the caves we were talking about. And you
Mhm.
can read it today very easily.
So you're drawing off of this wider history of Jews in China. If one were to say what you're writing is a Jewish journey to the West, that might sound oxymoronic to some folks, but it's actually not. It's completely imaginable. Even if this stuff didn't happen, even if this is a fantasy novel, it's historical fantasy because it's in the realm. I mean, in as much as all of these magic and monsters are in the realm of possibility, it's in the realm of possibility that Tang Monk writing in the middle of the 7th century could have met some Jewish traders who were there in China. The way you meld those traditions, the Jewish tradition and the Chinese tradition, I thought was really fascinating. Sometimes you retell Jewish stories with a Shioji journey to the West edge. So most listeners to this podcast will know the story of David and Goliath. And you retell the story of David and Goliath, but you have Monkey and Pigsy listening. And of course, the thing about Shioji, the journey to the West, is it's always about the weapon that Monkey or Pigsy pulls out and defeats the monster with in the end. You don't change anything about the story of David and Goliath and David grabbing his slingshot and, doing his thing. You don't change anything about that. It's just interesting to see Monkey enjoying himself thinking about this as if the slingshot is like his cudgel that he uses in the original novel. Tell me about like what was your thinking? What were you trying to do with that?
Part of what was happening is that I was thinking of my potential audience. And my potential audience is both people who are aware the Judeo-Christian traditions and also potentially people from the Chinese tradition. And I had an idea to put some of the biblical stories in, besides the later Talmudic stories in. So there's a couple of actual biblical stories in there, or echoes of them. Everything's tends to be a little bit twisted. And the story of David and Goliath is universal in a way. It's this little guy with a special weapon and an unexpected way of dealing with this larger foe. And I thought it would speak to a Chinese audience, but I have a Chinese audience. I have Monkey and Pig, and they're my Chinese audience in the book. So I have them react to how the story goes, and they're not they're not surprised at the basic storyline. They're waiting to see how it's going to happen. They're not surprised at what happens. They know the little guy's going to win, and he's going to have a special weapon. They're just curious as to how it's going to happen. I did this. I retell the story of Samson himself, the original Samson, in the book as well. But there I do it a little bit differently, where Samson's personality is sort of broken down. I will take a step back. I'm sure your listeners are aware that the different characters in the Journey to the West are really different aspects of a personality, right? The pig is the lustful glutton, the monkey is the little mischievous child inside of each of us with
Mhm.
a very dangerous weapon.
He's the masculine one because I mean the weapon is a stick that grows from small to big, and he gets angry. So it's a very masculine figure.
Very masculine figure, but he's childish. He has attention deficit.
There's a phrase in
It-
Chinese that Buddhists use called the monkey mind, controlling the monkey mind. That,
right,
when you
right.
talk about meditation, controlling the monkey mind is really important. He's drawing off of that tradition.
Which is why I should take up meditation. But I sometimes listen to Buddhist chants in my car, but it doesn't. Maybe it makes me a more calm driver, but besides that, I don't know.
That's
Anyway,
important.
so it's important. So I broke Samson down in the original Samson down into different parts of his character because he
Mm,
behaves differently depending what's going on. If you read the biblical story, he's very lustful. He's chasing after women,
mm.
gets into trouble, but he's also this very powerful, angry man. So I retell the story there as well. Well, most of the book is not biblical stories, but there's references in there to the crossing of the Red Sea, which appears in
I
a rather
wanted to talk about
twisted
that.
way.
I thought that was a great story. I mean, it's another example of how you incorporate these two very different traditions. Moses and Monkey meet, and they're comparing the size of their staffs. Again, I thought that was fantastic, drawing on this kind of masculine figure of Monkey. They're comparing what their staffs can do. Moses is having trouble getting his staff to work so that they can cross the Red Sea. You're reimagining this biblical story with Monkey in it. And Monkey is like, let me go get Princess Iron Fan. I think most listeners will know the Jews fleeing Egypt, crossing the Red Sea. Moses raises his staff, parts the Red Sea. The Jews cross. The waters come back down on Pharaoh's men. Princess Iron Fan is probably as famous in a Chinese context. You have Monkey who goes and has to steal an iron fan to cool off the these mountains that are there in Xinjiang today. Those mountains are real. They're a series of colorful red and orange mountains that mythically were incredibly hot. And so Monkey has to go into Princess Iron Fan. He literally goes into Princess Iron Fan. He shrinks down to the point, and he just essentially goes inside her and beats her guts until she lets it go. Again, we're talking about these very masculine. There's a lot you can do if you're Freudian with interpreting these things. So Monkey grabs Princess Iron Fan's fan and cools down the mountains. But in your story, Monkey goes to Princess Iron Fan and they talk about their longtime rivalry. And he's like, I need your help to get Moses and the Jews across the Red Sea. And she's like, why would I help you? And he's like, well, the Bodhisattva Guanyin she made me do this journey. Princess Iron Fan's like, oh, the Bodhisattva is doing it. Well, then I obviously have to do it, which is the correct Buddhist answer. Princess Iron Fan and Monkey go and help Moses part the Red Sea with the fan. It's a complete reimagining of this very old, well-known biblical tale with a Chinese twist, which I thought was really clever.
Oh, thank you. I like to be thought of as clever. Actually, there's a hint in the Bible that this is actually what happened. How did the Red Sea split? If you look at the verses, and we
Hmm.
usually don't, they're usually thinking of the movie or something. God brings a very strong wind from the east. Well, yeah, from the east, which blows away the water, and that's how the Red Sea becomes
Huh.
dry. So I had this wind idea, and I said, well, where do you get wind in the Chinese context? And Lady Ironfan shows up, and she's a real character. You know, for writing a novel, these Chinese characters are extremely convenient, and it's almost lazy to use them because they're very distinct characters. They're well developed, and you can pretty much predict how they're going to behave. So they're I brought her in, and Guan Yin is a really important character in the original novel. She appears a few times in my book. In fact, you've probably discussed this in the past, but as often as not, Monkey cannot accomplish what he's supposed to with his magic He goes and fights the monster, whatever it is, over and over again, and then he has to run off and get help. It's a recurring thing.
He's
Um,
always going, yeah, and grabbing Guan Yin or someone else,
Guan Yin or somebody else in heaven to help him out.
which is part of the Buddhist message. You can't do it on your own. You have to have the help of these gods and goddesses. Um,
Do you have the help of a god or goddess?
I do. My wife, yeah,
Yeah, so she has to appear in my book as well, but she's limited
Guan Yin, not my
because
wife.
Runyon, she has a more limited role because in most of the book, this is actually maybe an important point. I'm trying to meld two cultures together, and they have some things in common. There are things that are common in humanity, and there's things that you can twist and make combined legends, like we just talked about. There's something very different because Chinese pantheon is crowded, right? The Jewish heaven is a very lonely place. There's only one God. And I had to think of a way of how to have both those realms exist at the same time in the same story without conflicting. The way I did this is by basically splitting the earth in half. There's a Eastern heaven and Eastern gods, and there's the Jade Emperor and the heaven that monkey raised havoc in at the beginning of his history. And there's the Western world, which only has one God, and this is actually one of the more harder things for me to think of how to deal with that. And it was important to me not to make this a conflict between religions or worldviews. This is like really, really critical to me. I had people who said to me, "Oh, you should have had a debate like they had, like Kublai Khan had, or something, and see, who's right and whose tradition makes more sense." And I try to avoid that. I'm trying to have different people's accepting what the other people's worldview is and what their tradition is without it being a conflict.
You
Um,
say that seems to be one of the themes of your book. And I mean, this message crops up again and again. So the final passage in your book has Buddhist chants being sung right juxtaposed right next to so Buddhist chants and Jewish chants kind of being a psalm or something like that. And then there's another part. So I'm just looking at my notes from reading the novel. You have Seraphon say, "You are a sage in your own traditions. There is no need for you to become a sage in ours as well." This is what he's saying to Tang Monk Shenzeng. This comes up again and again. I don't want to impose a message or to say that every book has to have a message, but I think good books oftentimes have messages whether or not their authors want to. Is that the broader message of this book, that there are many paths to the same destination, that Buddhism and Judaism and maybe other religions are all trying to do something similar?
I think what you mentioned was actually true. I wasn't really thinking of a message when I was writing the book, but maybe my own personal feelings or philosophy came out without my consciously writing it in there. I go to Taiwan, I go to China, I go to Japan, and I could take this very monotheistic view of things and look at it and say, these are a bunch of pagan gods. These temples are pointless. What is all this Buddhism stuff? But I personally don't take that attitude. Instead, I come and I try to understand why people think differently or what they're thinking. I had a conversation with a fairly close friend, somebody I've worked with for many years in my engineering business. And I was explaining to this woman about the book, and we're talking about gods, and she explained how bewildering it was to her that we had only one God. Like, how is that possible? And to many people in the Western Jewish or Christian or Muslim world, the idea of having so many gods seems insane. Like, you're bewildered by this concept.
And certainly
But
many Romans 2000 years ago said that exact same thing about Judaism and Christianity, right?
right, we forget our own history sometimes.
Yeah.
So there are actually some other interesting parallels, but so I tried to approach it with respect. I think respect is the thing, and that you can learn from other people who have very different view of things. Doesn't mean you have to accept their entire worldview or their idea of what the gods are or anything, but the respect is the main thing. To deal with respect and to try to learn from other people. Buddhism is fairly popular among Jews. You see, many Jews are drawn to Buddhism.
There's a
The
phenomenon called the Jubu, right?
the Jubu. I've actually read a couple books about that, and I'm not sure how much is really common between Buddhism and Judaism. Maybe the fact that there's something different about them is what makes it attractive. Buddhism is it's kind of withdrawal from the world. It's not community oriented. Um, I think Confucianism maybe is more community oriented, but Judaism is very much involved with day-to-day life and with community and with rules for a community. It's a central thing in the Talmud, and you usually think of Buddhism, you don't think in that kind of term.
As we start to wrap this up, one of the things I think that's interesting about this book is that you started out with the thesis of this podcast, the thesis of the Chinese literature podcast, understand a culture through its literature. Like that's one path to understanding. And so you started out looking at these classical novels, thinking that this would be a way to understand China, and it seems to have worked. And I see this novel as melding of these two worlds that you have become a part of, your Jewish identity, but also your interest in China and Asia more broadly. Is that fair?
Yes, I think it's fair. You can you can learn a lot from literature. I've been surprised at times that I meet people from China or from Taiwan who may even be familiar with things I've read about, because some of these things have faded in the past, and traditions aren't static. Cultures aren't static. They change all the time. I know you deal with also modern Chinese literature, and there's a tendency to draw on the past and to use it, but your culture changes. It always does.
We were talking about this before we started recording, and Andrew Plax, who is my academic grandfather, that is my advisor, Marm Epstein, was advised by him. So Andrew Plax is one of the most famous figures in understanding this particular novel and other novels. He wrote the four masterworks of the Ming novel, which in a way taught Chinese people or retaught Chinese people how to read Xioji, The Journey to the West, and these other novels. You would think that Chinese folks knew how to understand these novels, but with the rise of the CCP in 1949, there was a 20 or 30-year period where reading these old style novels was something that was unacceptable. No one ever forgot. It was never the case that people stopped reading, but a lot of the higher level intellectual readings of these novels that are coming out of commentaries in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, those things they fell into disrepair. And Andrew Plax actually helped bring them back, not only in English, he was a professor at Princeton. And when he wrote that book, he also helped bring those kinds of reading, like how to understand Journey to the West, back. And he brought that back in China. So the statement that you made, traditions are never static. That's absolutely true. Traditions aren't bound to nations. It's not like Chinese people inevitably have a better understanding of how to read these texts and how to interpret these texts. Lots of different people can approach these texts. And there was a condition in China for about 30 years where it was really hard for Chinese folks to think about these texts seriously. One of the cool things about this book is that you show a very different way where you can engage with these traditions and bring a contribution. The Shioji, the Journey to the West itself, probably draws off of Indian tradition. So Monkey, he is probably a figure drawing off the figure Hanuman from Indian folk
Right,
literature.
right.
So we've got Indian folk literature that Chinese people are drawing off of to create Journey to the West. It's not really a fully quote unquote Chinese thing. and you're the next stepping stone. You're creating the Jewish version of the Chinese reinterpretation of the Indian folk tale. And the thing that I love about this book is it's that cycle. Now, all we need is for a person from modern day India to read your novel and reinterpret it in maybe a Hindu context or a Muslim context. That would be, I think, the next step, and then the circle would be complete.
Be interesting to see that.
Yeah. Now I'm going to ask a very un-Buddhist question, which is, where can listeners go to buy the book?
The book is published by Earnshaw Books out of Hong Kong. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever your favorite books are sold.
And we'll put a link to where you can buy the book on the podcast page, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Joel, it's been great chatting with you. This has been really, really fun. Thanks so much for
Thank you very much. It's been fun here too.
awesome. Thanks.
再见。
My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.